So, Kant. Let's start off by saying that if you've read Kant for today and you had the feeling you didn't understand what the heck was going on, you're not probably alone. Kant is tough. He's about, I think in order to understand and want to read is probably the hardest that we'll come across this term. So at least we're getting it out of the way. But it's also very interesting, in part because there's a nice contrast with Hobbes and Locke, but in part also because there's just interesting ideas, or an interesting way, at least, in which he puts in clear sight what the idea, what the whole point of the social contract approach is. So that's these first bunch of topics have been various forms of the social contract idea. So I'm going to do that all day. Start by giving you a little bit of background so that you know where we're coming from when we do read Kant and discuss Kant. And then I'm going to go over the beginning of the argument, which is just a few passages that you've read for today, and that'll get us going for the next two sessions. All right, here, some background, right? So, how will go? All right. So, if you've read Kant in, say, Intro to Ethics, or maybe some advanced ethics courses or something, you'll know that Kant has a very specific approach to moral philosophy, or philosophy in general. So in general, for Kant, philosophy is about sort of ordering the structure of reason, or the structure of the mind, the way that the mind perceives the world and so on. And so in his moral philosophy, what he does is he thinks that you can derive the content of ethics, right and wrong. You can all derive this from human rationality, the basic way in which we reason. Now, very quick and dirty version. He thinks that as rational beings, we have to live by rules. Otherwise, we're just being thrown around by our passions and our emotions and our appetites, desires, and so on. Okay, so we have to live by rules. Well, what is the content of these rules? Well, we don't know, because we're asking what it is that morality requires of us. What are the moral rules? So all we have is just the fact that they are rules. Now, rules, we know, have a general, universal character. And so we know from the idea, the rational idea of just that it's a rule, that it has to be universal. And Kant says we can actually crank that idea pretty hard and get some content out of it. It ends up being something like, not quite, but something like the golden rule. So don't do unto others as that you would have them do unto you. The idea being that only those rules are morally acceptable that we can all live by at the same time. Murder is wrong, because if everybody was allowed to just murder whoever they wanted, there wouldn't be a human race left anymore, including you, and so you couldn't continue to exist if we allowed murder. So that's not a universalizable rule. We can't all live under that rule, because we'd all be dead, and so murder is wrong. I'm doing violence to all sorts of subtleties and details here, but that's roughly the idea. And we'll see like you'll see in the readings, right? He constantly is referring to this universal law of freedom. And so that's him referring back to. He thinks the political philosophy is the same. It's going to take the same sort of rough form. It's him referring to the idea that whatever a good political philosophy is like, just like a good moral philosophy, has to be based on rules that are universalizable, that are generally applicable to all. Okay. So. He's going to give a theory of right that is also universalizable, but it's more narrow. It doesn't just look at what is right and wrong, but only at what is enforceably right and wrong. What are the things that we can actually demand that other people do or not do? And by demand, we mean quite literally like demand, but also demand with sort of by kicking their butts if they don't do. Yeah? Like, what can we actually make people to do? So that's what the metaphysics of morals, at least the first half, roughly is about. And all the sections that we read from that book and the first half of it. All right, so the method has to do with this deriving from reason, right? So like with this moral philosophy, he's trying to derive conclusions from just pure reason. So you'll never see Kant say something like this. But we need to have, we need to have social security because otherwise people, when they're old, they would be poor, and being poor really sucks. Right? That might be a good argument, but not for Kant, because things being, like people being poor and things being like sucky or whatever, those are facts about the world, things that we like and we don't like. Way too empirical, wishy-washy. It might happen to be true. Maybe if we don't have Social Security, people will invest in their pension funds much more prudently. You don't really know. Kant thinks that's all. No. Reason, pure reason. So it has to be like we're going to have these pure rational truths, like 1 + 1 = 2, doesn't depend just on the fact. It's going to be an analytic truth, hopefully. And then, so too, political philosophy has to be necessary and derived from reason. That's just part of his overall approach. He has reasons for taking this approach, but just go with it. So, what does that mean, right? Roughly, that means that he thinks that we can understand the nature of politics, or the nature of what politics ought to be like, by just reflecting on the nature of the relevant concepts or the ideas. So before I said, right, what is his approach to moral philosophy is to start thinking about, well, we have to live under moral rules. What are rules in general? What are universally applicable? So universalizability, that comes just from the idea of a moral rule. Right? So a proposed moral rule, murder is okay, cannot be a good moral rule because it doesn't fit with the idea of what a moral rule as a rule should be, because it's not universalizable, and any rule has to be universalizable. And so the same here, right? He thinks we can think about what the state is and what right is, and these things, concepts that he talks about. And once we really hone in on what these things are, what the state is, what its nature is, what right is, what its nature is, we can actually see that a variety of things are compatible with this and a variety of things are not. And so his political philosophy is supposedly, or so it's presented, right? It's the only thing that is actually compatible with the concepts involved, the pure ideas. And so it's rationally necessary. Inescapable if you want to be living a rational life. So that's why he says later, you haven't read this yet, but you'll read this for next time. He says later on in the Doctrine of Right, he says actually the original contract or the social contract for him is not like with Locke, something that was actually historically signed, or that we still sign through tacitly agreeing to sign it by being in the territory or something, right? No, he says, it's just an idea. It's only an idea of this act, the act being what Locke is talking about. And it's an idea in terms of which alone we can think of the legitimacy of a state. So it's a purely rational concept. Don't think when he talks about the original act of forming society as something that happened 2,000 years ago. He says this is a way of figuring out what that must be like for it to be good, to be right. All right, one more. So here you get it, right? So because for Kant, or maybe if, we don't think, maybe Kant is right, maybe he's not. But because or if the state has a necessary role, he says, and because, maybe if, this role is to guarantee right, that's his claim, Kant thinks that the state is morally mandatory. That's one of the upshots that we'll see next week. He thinks you cannot choose to get in or get out of the state. You have a duty to get into the state, moral duty, and you can be forced to get into the state. So very different from Locke in that regard. Next slide, I have a couple of contrasts and comparisons with Hobbes and Locke. Is this so far? I know this is super fast and rough, but is any questions about this so far? Kayla?
So he thinks that basically... So he thinks that any rule, any law, the idea of the state has to be universal?
Yeah, universal not in the like practical or factual sense that everybody believes in this or everybody has this role. All states actually perform this role, but in the rational or idea sense, right? So that the idea of the state has to be universalizable. So something that can, in any world that we can really conceive, that could be the role that the state plays. It really must be the role that the state plays if it's going to be doing the kind of thing that being a state it must do. So, yeah.
Was this a criticism of utilitarianism?
Well, he sure hates utilitarianism. That's safe to say. No, the political philosophy is not necessarily directed against. He has other he has other places where he sort of rails against utilitarianism. I think, well, I don't know. Kant scholars, I'm sure, can point you to sections where he's clearly addressing utilitarians and so on. But what is more clearly animating him is, I think he's quite explicitly taking on Locke. For next time, I'll ask you to read also the secondary reading by Ripstein. Ripstein makes a big deal out of this. Ripstein thinks that clearly the opponent is Locke. But also Hobbes in some ways, because Hobbes, we'll get to this in a moment, but Hobbes also thinks that the state is justified because it's rationally, because it's rational to it's rational to accept the state as compared to the state of nature. But Kant thinks that the Hobbesian way of thinking about rationality is mistaken. So for Hobbes, it's just sort of what's in your rational self-interest, like sort of maximize the payoff in a prisoner's dilemma situation. And for Kant, it's reason sort of with a capital R, like reason, like the deep sort of moral, like thick sense of reason. And so, you might have a really, like on Hobbes' idea, you might have a really weird preference ordering, right? Like maybe you're a masochist or something who really likes pain and suffering, right? Like not many of us do, but some people, right? So then maybe you like the state of nature. That's a problem, right? If we're going to say that the state is rationally required, because now we have these people for whom it's irrational to go into the state because they like the misery, right? So Kant doesn't like that because he thinks, well, your wants and those are not universalizable because we all have different desires. What is universalizable is this idea of reason more thoroughly. We'll have to see that still. We'll get to it, but that's why he's not agreeing with Hobbes, although he's closer to Hobbes than he is with Locke. And Locke is very much his target. That said, he does think that the utilitarians are sorry comforters, I think is the phrase that he used. Comforters. Is that right? Do you remember that one? I think it's in Perpetual Peace. Anyway, he talks about these people who... he thinks the utilitarians are people just constantly promising you that you'll become happy, and so he thinks these are sorry comforters who are spinning stories to keep people. Yeah, sort of. Yeah. So there's some phrases where he's clearly, in no uncertain terms, attacking them. But the political philosophy is not necessarily attacked. Most utilitarians were, although they saw themselves as addressing governments, wasn't necessarily a political philosophy in the same way. All right. Anyone else? All right. Here are some comparisons with Hobbes and Locke. So, this is just for you to get the big picture, right? Big picture, Kant agrees with Hobbes that there is no right or justice in the state of nature, although for different reasons. See that later. But he thinks so too. The state of nature is devoid of justice. It's a phrase. And he thinks that Hobbes is right that the state offers the authoritative determination of our rights. So the state, by law giving and enforcing it, settles what justice is. And the state of nature, because it has no settled conception of justice, that destroys the possibility of justice, he thinks. Just with Hobbes. The details are very different, but same overall view. He also thinks that because the state is solving this problem, so solving the problem of no justice possible in the state of nature, and there is justice possible under civil government because it's the authoritative settler of what is just, you cannot really disobey. Not permissibly anyway. You can do it in real life, but you can't do it with morality on your side. So, and we'll see this on Thursday next week. He is very explicit in this regard. For a long while, Kant's political philosophy was not discussed or studied a lot. The last couple of decades it has changed. Lots of people thought it was sort of, some people wrote that they thought that Kant, this is one of Kant's later works in life. They thought he's sort of slightly gone demented when he was writing this. Well, you can see sometimes why. He has some there are weird passages. There's a weird stuff on marriage. I think sex outside of marriage is this like a cardinal sin, basically. And maybe you believe that too, but the reasons are weird. The view is weird, I think, but the reasons are really weird. But he also has the stuff about no revolution or disobedience is ever permissible in the state. Ever, like never. Just don't. So, but then he thinks if you throw out one government, you put the other one in place, then you obey. Then you have a duty to obey the new one too, which is weird. It's weird to try and square that with the idea that you couldn't have overthrown the first one. Right. So, sort of you're wrong all the way until you're right, which is not exactly what you'd expect Kant to say. But anyway, so. But there's enough here that still to be interesting, and he has at least a nice way of explaining why disobedience would be wrong for him and for Hobbes. And if you have read him and you remember why for Rousseau, this is the same thing too. This is a kind of a feature inherent in the social contract idea, but we'll get there. So here's a difference. He agrees that there is no justice in the state of nature, but the problem is not factual. It's not this. You don't get enough goodies, right? It's not because your desires aren't fulfilled, because it's violent and you don't like getting hurt or something. No, that's not it. He thinks it's conceptual, right? So it's not just that. Like Hobbes says, well, in principle, justice is possible in the state of nature. It's just we can't get there because it's too uncertain. And Kant wants you to believe, no, it's not just that it's sort of like a practical problem to get. No, it's impossible. Even if we could have, even if nobody ever attacked each other in a state of nature, he says, justice would still be impossible. So, it's in the a priori nature of that condition, he says. Lots of expensive words, but the point is, you just can't get there. The nicest people in the world, put them in a state of nature, still no justice. There are similarities with Locke, although he doesn't like Locke much. One is the state is supposed to enforce people's pre-existing rights. He does think that even though the state of nature has no justice or no right in it, people do have rights. He does believe that it's derivable from reason, after all. You don't need the state for that, right? Reason is inside and outside the state. There are many paradoxical moments in Kant where he seems to be saying, well, we have rights, including property rights, but then we can't have right in the state of nature, even though it's unjust to the highest degree. If you've taken, if you've done some history of philosophy, you'll know about the dialectical method. This is generally what Kant is doing. He thinks that insight sort of arises out of opposition of ideas. You have right and no right, and together you get the sort of thesis and antithesis. And together you get the synthesis, which is the higher insight. So the fact that you have rights, but but it's not possible in the state of nature, shows you that the highest form of right is going to be under the state. Okay. So he does agree with Locke that there are pre-existing rights. He does agree with Locke that the job of the state is to make these secure. It's not like with Hobbes where the state just gets to invent everything it wants. There is a clear content to what it's supposed to do. Just when it does something different, you don't get to disobey. But there is a clear content. And he thinks that rights are in principle enforceable. So remember Locke, the natural executive right, state of nature, you get to punish wrongdoers. In principle, Kant thinks you don't need, there's nothing special about the state in the sense that it is somehow better than you and me, and therefore it gets to use force. No, the permission to use force is built into the idea of right. It's just part of what it is. To have rights is that they are enforceable. We've seen that with Locke too, right? All right. Differences with Locke, well, here's one. There are many, but here's one. The most important one for us, Kant thinks the state is morally mandatory and you can be forced to join. So he agrees with Rousseau in this sense that you can be forced to be free. So anyway, no consent requirement, right? You don't need to look. When was the express consent at the beginning? Did you tacitly consent? Can we get that property story where people inherited through the state? No, you don't need it. It's just by pure reason you can be forced into the state. Out of this situation of no justice into the situation of justice, and justice allows this. All right. That's the big picture, the sort of where you can situate him. Here's what we'll do today. So Kant makes 3 points. The state's role is to maintain right. Second, right guarantees external freedom only. And the right to freedom includes the permission to use force. Those are the three main points that we'll look at. And so together, Kant thinks this shows that the state is justified to use force to guarantee people's rights. That's the end point, where you use the morally mandatory nature of the state. Again, this is rationally given, right? Just by looking at the relevant concepts: state, right, state of nature. What force is? We'll see he has an argument about the nature of force, like coercion. So next time we'll see that that gets you to the requirement.
Do you think the United States of America is more conceptually Lockean, but more practically Kantian, at least in reference to how the state exercises its power?
Sounds like it makes sense to me, but can you explain a little more what you mean by
Okay.
conceptual and practical?
Because we have documents that speak to, Lockean
So
ideas.
is it like the rhetoric is Lockean, but the
Yes.
practice is...
Practice is Kantian.
yeah, that's probably right.
The state sort of justifies its right to use force by protecting people's rights, but all the rhetoric we see, all the rhetoric we're taught in school, and the fact that Locke comes so easily to people in America is because we've been brought upon those same ideals, but then the state acts in a very Kantian.
Yeah, right. And the founding documents are all about how the people are giving their consent to the government, right? And how some rights are inalienable, so you cannot, through your consent, give them to the government. And those are the limits of government. Those are lifted from Locke, right? But of course, yeah, you're right. It's when Henry David Thoreau said, "I don't want to pay my taxes. I'm going to live by myself at Lake Walden," they came and got him, right? So. Now, of course, by the letter, that is still Lockean, because he could have said tacit consent, but that letter is a little problematic, as we've seen. And Kant would have liked the fact that they got him, right? So yeah. So I think that's right.
How would Locke feel about it?
How would Locke feel about it? Well, yeah, I think Locke would agree that they should have gotten him.
Just not strong. He'd be like, well, okay.
Yeah, like, lead the charge. Yeah, with Locke at least it would be an open question, right? We'd have to see whether Lake Walden was within the territories of the United States, or if it was somewhere in an, let's assume it exists, some sort of uncultivated, abandoned part of, say, like northern Canada or something, whenever government was established. Then for Locke, it would say, yeah, sure, you get to go. And Kant would still say, no, it's a state of nature, this is horrible, get it back. Right? So at least for Locke, it would have to be something, we'd have to check into the facts of the story, see what the history was. And for Kant, we don't need facts, we have reason. So much better. Another way in which the practice is much more Kantian than Lockean is the way in which these days, but for a long time, US law treats property rights, which is not particularly Lockean. And Kantians think that there is a much more leeway for the state to redefine or reinterpret or sort of mess around with the way a property system is run and set up, whereas for Locke that is much more tightly circumscribed. So there was a time in the United States that at least for white people and men, the law was sort of Lockean in nature. But now it's for nobody. Where maybe that's overall for the better, but at least for that group, Lockeans would think it's gotten worse. That's not to say that, of course, Kant liked the earlier change. Like Kant is all about everyone has to be treated equally before the law, because it has to be universalizable and so on. So things like Jim Crow laws and stuff are absolutely impossible for Kant.
Slavery.
Right. Yeah. You can't have. Yeah. He was a clear opponent of slavery. He thinks it's a mistake. It's a category mistake, conceptual error to think that you could sell yourself, because you cannot be a self-owner. You cannot be both the subject that owns and the object of ownership at the same time. That's a mistake, he thinks. Anyway, so yeah, so that's not. I wasn't trying to suggest that Kant was a big fan of 19th century United States. All right. Anyone else? Since we're doing big picture stuff right now. All right, well, let's get to the nitty-gritty then. I asked you one of your reading questions. Kant talks about external law giving. That's what the job of the state is. And I asked you to think about what that means. Any thoughts? What is external law giving for Kant?
So he was talking about how could have distributed, but there's like this
Yeah, like everyone could have. So that's anyone could have. So that's
there's like somewhat conditions under which like choices come about, and these choices like have to be united with one another in accordance with like a universal law of freedom. So it seemed as if like these external laws that he was discussing was like you and I both have choices. The conditions that bring about our choices are going to have to be universal, and both of our choices are going to have to be acceptable to one another if we're going to make this universal law to where it can be applied to everyone. So like if we like on a smaller scale, you and I, but on a grander scale, like all of us. You know, like so. It seems like the external law giving obviously has his universal clause like everything else, but they kind of got grabbed for like choices that we have.
yeah. So good. It's definitely about people's ability to make choices. It's definitely about making sure that that ability is universalizable, so that everyone can have the freedom to make their choices. We have to be careful about the details. So, yeah, sure.
I thought external law giving somewhat similar to what Dominic was saying, but was more of a positive right than a negative right. Like,
What do you mean by that? Positive or not negative, right?
the rights or actions being subject to the actions of another person. In this case, I thought it had something to do with state giving the loans. Perhaps I was wrong.
Okay. Well, let's see. I've got the section here that's the relevant one. Maybe we'll walk through this together. So it says the concept of right. So remember what he's doing, right? He's saying we can all derive this from just the pure ideas. So it's the concept of right, insofar as it's related to an obligation corresponding to it. So if we're talking about rights, the type of rights that we can claim on others, right? That's what ultimately the state is about. We can say, hey, you have to do this, like it or not. So it has to do first only with the external and indeed practical relation of one person to another. Just let's stop reading for a second. External and practical relation of one person. What do you think he's talking about? Yeah, so when are our actions external and practical? Like when you're actually touching each other? Yeah, right. So physical stuff, right? So the extensionally defined movements, right? So like I move from here to there, that's external and practical action that that has to do with my relation to you because it means you can no longer move to this spot, right? It's a simple example. Of course, if I have a property right in this table here and I put my table here, now I'm occupying both this spot here and that spot over there, right? So there's stuff like that. Okay, so that's definitely what it has to do with, right? It has to do with this external physical rights and obligations. So second, it does not signify the relation of one's choice to the mere wish, hence also the mere need of the other, as in actions of beneficence or callousness, but only relation to another's choice. So he says, look, we're talking about the external stuff, just like swinging your arm, and then whether or not you hit another person's face, right? That matters. But then the reason why I might do this doesn't matter at all, right? If I hit you by accident, that has to do with right. I might violate your rights. But if I hit you on purpose, it seems to be the same thing, right? In fact, I might think that I'm saving you or something, right? I might do this out of goodwill for you. Maybe I think you need some tough love, right? I think this will straighten you out. Smack, right? Doesn't no better than if I do it because I think you're a jerk. Smack, right?
Sounds like a consequential clause kind of thing, like your intentions don't matter in your actions.
Yes, although he's very far from a consequentialist, right?
Yeah, like that's what he's like kind of implying there. That's why I got confused when I was like
Yes, okay, good. First of all, good that you read it 5 times, because you need to read Kant at least 5 times before you can understand anything he's doing. Well, then you have the rest to do to catch up. Yeah, but so it's a good worry that you're having, and you're right in both ways. First, remember that we're talking about politics here, right? Which he thinks is a narrower domain than just ethics in general. So he's right that when we're talking about whether you did the morally correct thing, it matters very much for what reason you do it. Hitting someone by accident is, morally speaking, ethically speaking, in terms of your virtue and so on, very different from hitting someone out of spite. But for politics can't look inside your head. And politics, so therefore, shouldn't be trying to occupy itself with making sure that you do things out of the right motives or for the right reasons. What politics should do is just making sure that you do externally in your physical behavior the right thing.
So you can't create a law that ends up having awful consequences and say, I had great intentions with it?
No, if the consequences are awful in the sense of people's rights being violated and so on, then yeah, that would be too bad. Yeah, so it's not clear, for example, if there should be much of a difference between things like involuntary manslaughter and murder, right? So you hit someone with a car, that's the external relation is the thing that matters. It's the thing, what's in your head, you can't tell. It's really not the state's business anyway, Kant thinks. So, but of course, when we judge you as a moral agent, very different story. But politics is this much narrower, has this much narrower focus. So that's where I think that's where the tension was. Okay?
So, see if I can like condense this sort of. So, Kant says that, like, for example, you hit someone, it doesn't matter why you hit them, the consequence is going to be still the same, whether that's a good consequence or a bad consequence, and that consequence is all based off of reason. And so it's
I'll say 2 things. I'm a little, we have to watch out with invoking the terms consequences here, because Kant is, like I said earlier, he's diametrically opposed. He's as hostile to consequentialist thinking as anyone can be, basically. Now, maybe what you were saying doesn't really depend on that, but let's watch out that we don't slip into thinking that for him a good state is one that has sort of the best, that brings about the best results or outcomes. That's not what he wants to say at all. Now, second, the first point you said, well, when you hit someone, it doesn't really matter for what reason you hit them. In many ways, Kant thinks it does matter, right? When we're judging you as a person and so on, it matters a whole lot. But the one way, the narrow way in which it does not matter is whether this is the state's business or not. So it's the state's business only insofar as a hitting happened. Right? That puts it within the realms or within the job description of what the government is supposed to be about. So some person really hates another person, right? Or some person says really mean stuff to another person. None of the state's job. I think that's just not the business of the government. Because that's just inside of your head, and there might be sort of thoughts that are floating out, and maybe they're bad, maybe they're not bad, but different. What's the business of the state is once we start actively infringing on each other externally. So when your body and my body start coming into contact, or my stuff and your body, my bullet comes into contact with your arm, right? Now we're talking about the state's business.
So, like in a court of law, if someone murders someone, and the murderer's conscience is like, well, I did it out of self-defense, or like whatever their reasoning was for the manslaughter, that's none of the government's concern, or that's none of the government's business. The government's business is just the fact that to deal with the fact that someone was murdered.
Yeah, I think for now that's good enough. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if Kant would be committed to that thing, but let's put it. It's close enough for now anyway. And the take-home message is Kant is trying to define here what what's this playing field, right, of politics. Because if you remember, he's trying to think about what the role of the state is going to be by thinking about what the nature of the game is. Right? And so it's the nature of, what is that thing, politics? Well, it's about our external actions. Right? Why? Because the state has a certain toolbox available, right? And the toolbox is the law, and the law can't really get inside your head. What the law can do is it can make sure that everyone has their external freedom, as he calls it. And so that's what Dominic was pointing out, saying like this is the freedom to make choices. So ultimately he thinks, you might want to choose for one reason, I might choose for another reason. We can't all expect people to want exactly the same thing. We can't all expect people to make the same kind of deliberations or act for the same motive or on the same intentions. But what we can do, right, so we can't legislate what type of choices you make and why you'll make them. What we can do is we can make sure that you have a choice to make, I have a choice to make, and everyone can make their own free choices. And so that's what the government is supposed to be doing, and the law is supposed to be doing, is it's sort of like parceling up the world into your freedom to choose, my freedom to choose, separated by our rights.
So everyone has the freedom to choose something different as long as it doesn't clash with
The freedom from other people to choose. Yes, exactly.
It's like Hobbes would say the government made one rule and that goes for everyone. You cannot go against that. Or,
Yeah, I'm not sure I see the contrast, but you're getting Kant right, that's for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and so for Kant, the problem, like the state is not doing its job when it protects the freedom of choice of some people at the expense of the freedom of choice of others, right? So this is one of the reasons he's against slavery or feudal practices where you have lords or masters who have the freedom to do a whole bunch of things, make a bunch of choices. But that their freedom to choose is defined in a way that negates the freedom of choice of others, right? The slaves or the serfs or something. Right? And that's not possible. So in a good civil society, everyone has an equal freedom of choice, independent of one another.
so I'm just making more clear since it's not asking a promise.
Okay.
Like wrap my head around. So, for example, like with religion or something, everyone is allowed to choose for like a religion that they want as long as it does not harm or go against. It's like as long as it doesn't clash with the other.
Yeah, so you get to choose, you have a right to choose your religion, you don't have the right to impose your religion on others.
So kind of
'Cause-
like with, like during the Protestant Reformation and stuff like that, would common be completely against the Catholic Church saying that everyone had to be Catholic. Like common.
Yes, he doesn't like the Catholic Church very much. No, that's for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't like trying to like say. I was just trying to make a comparison, but like how to.
No, but you're right. Yeah, but I was giving you some extra information. It's like that he has passages where he's taking clear jabs at the Catholic Church, ecclesiastical dynasties, and so he thinks actually the state should disappropriate. Like, is that the word disappropriate? Anyway, take the Roman Catholic Church has these enormous wealth and riches of land and buildings. I think the government should just take that because it's all unjustly acquired, and so he's quite hostile. Is my point. Yeah. All right. So we saw first it has to do with the external part. It doesn't have to do with the internal part, right? It doesn't have to do with your desires or your motivations. The state should not care about whether we have nice feelings towards one another or whether we are cold-hearted towards one another. The only thing that the state should care about is that we, in our external actions, treat each other with the respect that we can all insist on, that we don't violate each other's rights. So similarly here, third, is the same point, but with in a different respect. He says, look, if it doesn't matter whether you do it out of beneficence or callousness, your motivation or your desires that might give rise to a certain action, it also doesn't matter. No account is taken of what he calls the matter of choice. It's not the happiest of terms, but it's what he means, whatever end it is, whatever you're trying to achieve or something, right? So yeah, that was the point of like you might try and rescue someone by shoving them out of the way, but if you still shove them, that might constitute a rights violation by shoving them. Yeah.
So what would Kant say with like the idea of freedom of speech where people will say, like they'll say something, really racist or really bigotry or something that is like incites harm, it's like, some sort of harm to another being, but they would say, oh, but it's my,
What do you mean incites harm?
or like, for example,
Like really upsetting, you mean? Like,
or like, for example, there was a gun shop owner in Florida who said that it was his right to not sell guns to Muslims, and like would sell jihadist target things. But he said that was his right to be able to do that, and that it was his freedom of speech to say like things like, oh, well, we're not, or how. So he would say that is his right, but would Khan say like no, absolutely, because that's violating another person's right?
so it's difficult. That's difficult to say. I think the answer would be, well, it's always hard to predict what Kant says because he always takes twists and turns and then tells you that this is clearly the only way it could have gone. But at least in the beginning, it's surprising. But for now, I think it's safe to say you probably would say yes, it's his right, as long as he's not physically interfering with the ability of other people to exercise their rights.
What if somebody had a Muslim buy a gun?
Well, I can go to another store, right? Like this one. Now, of course, if he starts following him around and every time they want to go to the store, start like, no, right? Or grabs them or like maybe throws them out of the country or throws them in his basement. Or so, like if he starts physically interfering with their ability, and that's a different matter. But if he just says, I won't sell it to you, then probably that's okay for Khan.
Just playing devil's advocate, what if that was the only gun shop?
Well, it's not, right? And it's not, and the government shouldn't act in such a way as to make it the case that only one person can have a gun shop or whatever shop, right? So if the government is just, then anyone can open up their own gun shop. Or if you don't think like guns, then somewhat like whatever shop, right? Now, if the government does do that, then it is preventing people from exercising their rights to sell things that are okay to sell.
Sorry, I was
In
just
this
trying to
case.
apply that maybe to like
Right.
some other things I could like kind of
Right.
So with the gun shop example and saying that only one gun shop being available, that would be consequential over factual versus conceptual. Factual reasoning being that there just only happens by happenstance there would be one gun shop. As long as the government is not actively playing a role in limiting of people's freedom to open up, then Kant is all right with it.
Yeah, I think that's okay for now. Yeah.
Because he's very much at least perpetual peace. He's very much on the side of liberalism.
Yes.
And free markets and like democracy and stuff.
Yeah, and later in the Doctrine of Right, that sections you don't read those sections for this class, but elsewhere he says things that. Well, there are remarks where he hints that like a competitive market in which there's a lot of buyers and a lot of sellers give us the kind of freedom and independence that he cares about. And he thinks sort of like the old hangovers of the feudal system, like guilds and people who live with. So, for example, a servant who lives with their master in the house, he thinks don't have the right to vote because they're too dependent on their master. So you can't really trust them to make their own independent choice, for example. But if you have this sort of a free market-ish, like the ideal free market, he thinks that's much better in that regard. Yeah. So there are lots of details that are tricky here, but for now, I'm going to move on because we're just trying to sort of demarcate the playing field, right? So when is it the government's business? You don't get to invoke the government or the law because you don't like the end that another person is trying to achieve, right? This person is trying to get a bigger house than me. Someone stop them, right? Like, no. This person is starting a business that is going to outcompete my gun shop. Close them down, right? No, you don't get to do that. Put an import tax on tires from China because they're offering them for too cheap, right? No, can't have that. Not for that reason anyway. The only reason can be because this external part is involved, because someone's rights are being violated. All right. So here's the definition of the universal principle of right. Right? So right is, here's the concept of right, demarcating it, and it's a summary, universal principle of right. This is going to be the organizing principle of the whole theory. Any action is right if it can coexist with everyone's freedom in accordance with the universal law. Just if if it can coexist with everyone's freedom, universalizable, right? Everyone side by side at the same time. Or if on its maxim, it's just sort of the, never mind, the freedom of choice of each can coexist with everyone's freedom in accordance with the universal law. So basically says an action is right if it is consistent with general or universal freedom of choice for people. Action therefore is not right in the sense of it's the government's business to prohibit it when it is inconsistent with people generally being free to choose. Now you can see, right, doesn't mean just free to choose anything, right? Doesn't mean that like if you kill someone, well, that was my choice and I have freedom of choice. No, it's a constrained freedom of choice. It's the constrained freedom to choose within those options that you have available if other people can have the same type of freedom of choice as well. Right? So you can see that Kant would like to have something where like you probably have, if you imagine sort of all choices in sort of a space, right? And everyone having a little circle or something that is your freedom of choice within that large space. You want to make everyone's bubble of choice, circle of choice, as big as they can be without the circles starting to intersect each other. Right? Without one person's freedom of choice like impinging on another person's freedom of choice. And that's what we have a right to claim against others. And we're talking about obligations, right? That's what the government is supposed to be there for. All right, so far so good? I'm going too fast? All right. So, right is about guaranteeing people's their freedom, external freedom. So what's freedom for Kant? So here's a phrase that Kant uses, 6.2.3.1. You'll see these things are, by the way, these are in the margins. It's the Prussian Academy notation. Anyway, that's sort of the, between different editions of Kant, that's the new way of signaling where things are that is consistent. Because you can, whichever edition you have, the pages in the actual book can be very different. So that's the, anyway. So if you look for it, you find it in the margin. That's my point. So he says, whatever is wrong is a hindrance to freedom in accordance with universal laws. So freedom in accordance with universal laws, that's just that bubble, like everyone has their equal bubble and we don't impinge on each other, right? Freedom of choice, consistent with everybody else having a freedom of choice. And so wrong, things are wrong whenever they're not right, right? So it's the opposite of that, right? So if right means freedom of a choice, then wrong hinders that. It's an impinging on it. Right? So it's a very woolly, complicated way of saying it's not the thing I called right. Right? So actually, Kant thinks there's only one innate right that we have. He thinks that the only right that we have as human beings is this right to have free choice. So if you want to talk human rights or something, there's only one human right. Right? All the other human rights are derivable from this one. And it's freedom, so independence from being constrained by another choice. Right? So independence of another person's choices limiting or constraining your freedom of choice. That's the only innate right, freedom. It's external freedom. Insofar as it can coexist with the freedom of every other in accordance with universal law, is the only original right belong to every man by virtue of his humanity. Right? So, blah, 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 blah. Just everyone has equal freedom of choice. That's the point. That's the right.
It's similar to Hobbes, but minus the survival thing, the survival clause Hobbes has. Is that what it is, pretty much?
Well, no. But I'm wondering why you say that. Maybe I'm misunderstanding you. My initial reaction is no, but it's...
Because the Hobbes says we have a freedom to choose anything as long as it's towards our survivability.
Oh, yeah, good. Yes. Yeah, that's why I said no. I said no because you're right, of course, that he says we have a freedom to choose. But for... And you're also right that they are... well, we'll set that aside. It's freedom to choose, but... Where for Hobbes, this means a freedom to choose anything, right? Whether anything is like we should underscore anything, because it means including another person's body, whatever, right? Anything you deem conducive to your own survival, you have the liberty to use, right? Of course, that's very different from Kant, because in Kant, I cannot use your person for my own ends, because that's not consistent with you having your own freedom to choose what happens to your person, right? And so you don't get to choose me for your ends, because it's not consistent with me having the freedom to choose for my own, right? And so what we can demand of the state is that the state protects us from each other in that regard only. So the state must make sure that you get to choose without me dictating what your life is going to be about or what your day is going to be like, and vice versa. Now, you do bring up a good point, which is the doctrine of right, which is Kant's political philosophy, is separated into two parts, private right and public right. Private right being the part of right that we don't need the state for, right? And public right being the state-built one. This is all private right. So you're right to say that this is in principle the way that right should exist in a state of nature, just like Hobbes's freedom. But it's not like Hobbes's freedom, because it's actually quite a bit similar to the one that Locke says. Notice that he defines freedom here, or he at least relates freedom explicitly to your rights. Right? So remember, if like Locke says, liberty is not license, because you're free only to the extent that you don't impinge on other people's rights, and that's exactly what Kant is saying. Right? Much of what Kant is doing is taking a bunch of concepts from Locke, this type of freedom, the idea that freedom can be enforced, or the right to freedom can be enforced, and then turning it on its head, right? And saying, Locke, you think that this consent theory follows nothing of the kind. Right? So. All right, is this clear so far? So look at what we've done, right? We've looked at external freedom, the idea of right insofar as the state can be involved, and why he thinks that this involves, well, sorry, we said I could write enforcement. It's not about enforcement. The next slide is about enforcement, but anyway. We'll get to why this is about why this kind of right can be enforced. So, the idea is that you have some sort of mutually consistent freedom. Right? So roughly here's the argument to summarize the passages we've just seen. So a legitimate state enforces what is right in a way that treats each of us equally. By equally, we just mean in a way that's universalizable, right? That applies sort of impartially between us all. Or, as he would put it, in accordance with the universal law of freedom. That's just every time you see that law, like he's reminding you that has to be the sort of this equal without, you know, the Lady Justice is blind, right? Like she doesn't see like you're from a better family or you're tall or you're short or whatever, right? Just equal freedom, universally applied. So that's what a legitimate state should do. It's like to enforce what is right. The state cannot force what people want or what they're motivated by, the ends that they want to bring about or whatever, right? Without failing to treat us equally. Now that's true because we can't all expect people to want the same thing, right? You can't really enforce what's inside your head. And even if you do, even if it were possible, it would not respect us equally because we can actually give each other the freedom to choose, despite all of us wanting different things. So we want different things. We can't make people want the same thing, but even if we could, it wouldn't be a good idea because we can actually respect each other without getting inside of each other's heads.
So he would be very much against redistributive justice?
Yeah, it's a contentious question you ask. The standard, historically, he has been read in somewhat libertarian, as a libertarian writer. He has passages in the Doctrine of Right which seem very clear, put it that way. He says, for example, that he doesn't say that there shouldn't be any redistribution. He says there could be any redistribution, but only to provide for people, and here's a quote, most natural needs. natural human need. So really, the suggestion seems to be there can be some sort of poverty provision, but only to stop you from dying and nothing else. But I'm saying it's a...
Absolute poverty versus relative poverty.
Yeah. Yeah, so right, so most natural human needs, right? So like it's really like physically just not perishing. Of course, relative poverty is all factual, right? It depends on how rich the society happens to be today, which is not the same as the next year, and so can't have it depend on that. It has to be something that we can pinpoint with certainty. Now, the reason I say it's contentious is that there is over the last 10 years there have been a number of really, really interesting and good books and articles in philosophy where people, including Ripstein's, where people interpret Kant to be much more redistributive. So there is sort of a new movement of people reinterpreting Kant who claim that even if he didn't believe it himself, it has all the resources for justifying something like, well, some people argue all the way up to basically socialism. And the point is, of course, that the state starts defining justice, and now you have a lot of wiggle room, right? Yeah. So, but the arguments are much more interesting and like, that's something to wrestle with. So.
So like how people who were Rawlsian have taken sort of Rawls's arguments, even though he didn't intend it for immigration or cosmopolitanism, and sort of say, well, based on your argument, that's sort of the consequences.
Right. Yes, right. So some people said a consistent application of Rawls is Rawls across the world, not just Rawls in one country, which is what Rawls himself thought. Yeah, so people now claim that if you really take Kant's theory seriously all the way to the end, then you get... They don't say you get only socialism, but they say it leaves it open. That's the view now. It leaves it open everything from libertarian to socialist and everything in between. I don't buy it, but that's a different story. And again, I wouldn't, so take that with a grain of salt. So, we have got the first two, right? So what a legitimate state does is enforce right in a way that treats us equally or universally. State cannot force people to be what they want or what they are motivated by, but they can enforce what people have a right to choose to do, what they want, what they happen to want. Right? What they want is just a mere fact, so we can't really rely on that being universal. You might want one thing, you might want another. We don't even need to. But what we can do is we can universally guarantee everyone that they have a right to choose whatever it is that they want to choose. Of course, consistent with other people having the same right. We're guaranteeing it to everybody as the state. So, therefore, here's what a legitimate state should do. It should enforce the right for people to choose equally in a way that's universalizable. And so the universal law of right, so act externally that the free use of your choice can coexist with the freedom of everyone in accordance with the universal law. That's just this stuff every time. He just keeps banging you over the head with it. He seems to get off on this. So, it's indeed a law that lays obligation on me. So that's it, right? That's where real obligations come from. Right. So far, so good? That's roughly what's going on in those first couple of paragraphs, right? He defines right. He tells you what it's about, what it's not about, and so there you get, just by thinking about the concept, right? State, freedom, enforcement, obligation, right? We get a conclusion about what the state is supposed to do. That's his method in action. All right. So here, now we have the argument for enforcement. So if we're talking about everyone having the right to be free to choose for themselves, Kant thinks the state can actually use coercion, right? Police, prisons, fines, these kind of things, guns, you know. And he thinks it's not because the police is special or more reliable or nicer or better trained or something. Those, again, are just mere facts, right? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Probably they aren't. No, necessarily, right, being this freedom to choose, can be enforced. So that's part, again, of the idea of right. So here's the argument. This will be the last thing. Coercion is a hindrance or resistance to freedom. It's just the definition that he gives in that paragraph. It's a quote. Right? Can you think about what does it mean, by the way, a hindrance, a resistance to freedom?
Like coercion is like an antonym of freedom. You know, like you have the freedom to choose something, but if somebody's coercing you, like choose it. You're not free to choose it yourself. So this coercion is the polar opposite of what freedom is.
Right, good. So, quick question. A storm hits your house, right? Are you being coerced? Like,
Coerced to do
well, let's say like you can't go out, right? The storm is too powerful for you to go out safely. Is this coercion for Kant?
yeah, it's a hindrance. It's resisting my freedom to walk out the front door if I can't run get out my front door. And if it's that bad, then it's not good.
Mm-hmm.
I think for coercion, you must have the human element to it.
Why would that be? I think you're right, but why would that be?
Because coercion deals with person to person, not something like an act of God, if Kant would choose to put it that way.
Right. Yeah, so remember what freedom was? Like freedom is your ability to make your own choices independent of others, right? So let me just, here, right? So freedom is independence from being constrained by another's choice. And I'm not trying to get you, right? I'm just trying to make a point here. But he's thinking very clearly of freedom, and so therefore the kind of external freedom that the state can protect as something that we can claim between each other, right, or against others. So freedom for him, he's only interested in freedom insofar as that means that other people don't put their wills on you, right? Another theme, by the way, from Locke, right? If you remember, Locke, natural liberty was not having to ask leave or depending on the will of another person. So Kant takes that very seriously. Right? In a free society, we're not subject to the will of others. We have each our own little area in which we are mini sovereigns, you might say. Right? Your will gets to decide what happens in your little circle, and then in my little circle, my will decides, and that's freedom. Kant's moral philosophy a little. This is all autonomy in the background, right? So it's like living by your own will. Okay. So, if coercion is a hindrance or resistance to freedom, and freedom is this absence of being constrained by other people's wills, then coercion has to be the impinging, right, of another person's will on what is supposed to be your separate little sphere of choice. Now it's a hindrance or a resistance, meaning you are supposed to be, you have some type of ability to do it, and there is a power that's working against you, right? So something is preventing you from being able to exercise your will, in this case the will of another person. They could physically do it, right? They could threaten you to do it. It's like some way they are preventing you from exercising your will. And that puts you under their will. So far, so good? It's an interesting idea of coercion, right? It's not clear that this is, I mean, he's free to define his terms as he wants, right? Like we can, as long as we just keep in mind that this is what he means with coercion, then that's fine. Of course, if we claim that the state's business is only this type of coercion, now we have to wonder whether this is the right way to think about, if that's really all that matters about. Maybe these type of acts of God or whatever, like storms, are coercive in another way. What's next to see? De-coercive or something, right? And then maybe that's still the business of government. Kant is defining that out of the possibility of what the state can be done with, right? So you have to always, when he's making these steps, wonder, like, wait a minute, is this an innocent definition, or is this actually something being slipped underneath the door? I don't know if that's the right metaphor, but whatever. All right, so that's one. Coercion is a definition, right? Now, if an act hinders a hindrance to something, then that action promotes that thing. So here's the quote, right? Resistance that counteracts the hindering of an effect. I ask you to look at this argument, right? Promotes this effect and is consistent with it. Any thoughts? What's the point? Oh, go ahead, tell me.
I was going to say, so someone hindering someone, like negates that, so it's okay, right?
Yeah, right. So it's We've seen this a little bit before. It's like a double negative, right? So minus and minus makes plus. So, right? He draws on the page after this passage. He has an analogy with physics and mathematics, right? Where he just basically says that if you have two opposing forces, they cancel each other out. Right? So if hindering is canceling out freedom, then if you have a hindering that cancels out the hindering, then what you left is freedom, right? And so that's of course how the argument will run through.
And
Cameron?
I just thought of is like Panthers versus the Broncos. Cam Newton has the freedom to move that ball in the field. He didn't use that freedom very often, but that's beside the Cam Newton's trying to move the ball in the field by throwing it, but there's an opposing force coming towards him that's trying to impede his freedom, which they did like 6 times. If Cam Newton's protection was working properly, they would hinder that hindrance that was coming towards Cam Newton's face mask and every part of his legs. So yes, that is the concept.
And he would remain free.
To
Right.
the Panthers versus the Broncos.
Right. And the point that Kant is trying to make is that he would remain free, right?
He
If the
would remain
hindrance.
free to move
Right.
that ball down
Right.
the field had the hindrance not
Right.
touched his freedom.
Michaela, can you top this or not? Go for it.
That's not very funny, but
Kant is a very serious guy, so this is. He had no sense of humor. Well, according to some biographies, he was quite the life of the party. Apparently, yeah. There was a recent biography of Kant where it turned out that he was just laughing. Well, yeah. So his reputation is to be very dour, extremely routine. Famously went for a walk every day in Königsberg, and to punctual. Germans are very freaking punctual, but punctual to the time that legendarily the housewives of the town set their clocks to when he came by. So that's how punctual. So that's how he. So he had fixed hours in the morning when he would sit down and write, and then he would and then he would go for his walk, and so. But apparently he was the life of the party. That's what the biography. Anyway. If you haven't learned anything, you can tell stories about Kant now. Yes. Yeah, very German.
Then I came in degrees.
Go for it.
So Kant is basically saying that the government has a right to use coercion to exit out hindrance so other people can have freedom.
Exactly.
So even though their coercion is resisting someone's freedom to do what they want, that freedom that person wants to do what they want is infringing on someone else's freedom. So the government has the right to infringe on someone's freedom, even though the rest of the people don't.
Right, and they have that right because by using coercion against that infringer, they are reinforcing the original freedom that people have a right to. Right? But yeah, that's perfect what you just said. So why would it be that the state can use coercion when coercion normally looks wrong, right? And Kant says, well, yeah, it is wrong when it's a hindrance or resistance to freedom. But if somebody is doing that, hindering or resisting a freedom, they're committing a wrong. We've seen that before, right? Wrong is whatever hinders freedom. So it's a wrong by definition, right? And then what we have is a coercion that does that away, right? That cancels out this hindrance to freedom. Then we have a hindrance to freedom, right? And a hindrance to a hindrance promotes it or is consistent with it. And so what we want is right and freedom. We have something that's negating it. Now we're negating the negation, and so we have the thing itself again, right? The freedom again.
So was this kind of a outlying view in Germany during Kant's time, or is this like yeah, Kant's right, or was everyone like, what the heck is he talking about?
Oof. I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, Kant was definitely a celebrated figure in his day. Yeah. Another famous story, when at his funeral there were like over 1,000 people apparently there. So it's very famous.
Hey now.
Yeah, it's not gonna happen to me, that's for sure. So yeah, and he was a professor at the university and stuff. So he was very highly regarded. At the same time, I mean, some of the things he says about like the importance of equality before the law, for example, the ways in which sovereigns should or must consider themselves to be bound by the law as well, not clearly consistent with things that were going on during his time, right? So I don't know what. Yeah.
What time was it written by?
You want to try?
His lifespan was 1724 to 1804.
Yeah. This is I think
I
1790s.
groundwork was written before the Physics of Worlds,
Might be in here.
probably late 1700s.
So like,
Well, the groundwork was definitely written before the. This is a
Yeah.
late work. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was probably late 1700s.
so Khan would be like completely anti-Nazi, but like completely anti.
Yeah. Safe.
Oh, I forgot about
That's safe to say. Yeah. Very safe. So yeah, it wasn't published until 1797, although he claimed by 1768 to have written the thing, but whatever. Well,
He already had 10.
right, 1797. So there are some in some other short essays. There are some remarks about the French Revolution, for example. He was very hostile to the French Revolution. But that's the. Apparently, he wrote it before the French Revolution, but he was still didn't like it. And the implication of it would be that it was a bad thing.
So, coercion is wrong in any term. So, the wrong preventing the other wrong is right. So, two wrongs make a right.
Well, it wouldn't be a wrong, right? Because you're undoing a wrong.
Right.
And so the means that you use to undo the wrong cannot itself be wrong
Correct.
by this argument, right?
So, only one wrong makes a right. Because the other one is not wrong.
Well, so it's
Yeah, that's right.
so it's an interesting point, right? It says coercion is a hindrance to freedom. Now, if you're hindering a hindrance to freedom, then that must itself involve coercion, right? Coercion to undo coercion. But that means that the coercion that you're trying to justify, well, he wants to say it's right? But by definition, it seems to be if it's a hindrance to freedom, by definition, it's wrong, right? Because remember, what is wrong is always a hindrance to freedom, right? So we have this seeming contradiction. So again, I think this is part of what you see this happening over and over in Kant. It's part of the dialectic method, right? So because there is an opposition here between coercion and coercion, you get the synthesis, which is coercion, which hinders prior coercion, is itself right, even though it seems wrong. So now, I'm not sure that works, right? When you might say that, look, I'm beating up justice, right? Like, so I'm coercing him because I'm violating his freedom. I'm hindering his freedom. Now, whatever you do to stop me from doing that isn't really a hindrance to my freedom because I'm overstepping my freedom, right? So you're not hindering me from actually enjoying my rightful freedom because I'm overstepping it. So if you stop that, then you're not really coercing me, right? If you're not really coercing me, you're not really hindering me. Right? If you're not really hindering me, you can't be a hindrance to a hindrance, and so therefore, right?
It's almost like you're crossing, there's a line in the sand. And if you cross over that line in the sand, we're pushing you back behind that line because that's where you're supposed to be in the first place.
Yeah, that seems to be
So
right.
I'm not coercing you, I'm just,
Yeah. One way in which it might apply to things like punishment, right? Like, so you might think that if you throw someone in prison, then you are really taking away what would otherwise have been their rightful freedom. And then in that case, for that, this argument might apply. But for just undoing the wrong itself, like stopping me from I'm not sure the argument works, but so yeah, it's an interesting point.
Does he put a qualitative difference between a state being the one who resists these kind of things versus the individual?
Yeah, good question.
Because if there's ever a situation where maybe an individual stops someone or he hindered someone's hindrance towards something that would be just seen as the state as an okay or permissible thing.
Yeah, so frustratingly, I think the answer is both yes and no. The answer is yes, he thinks it's different because the state is the only thing that can do it legitimately. And remember, in a state of nature where it's only individuals, justice isn't possible. And it's, well, we'll see next time why he thinks this. But, and so here's the no part, he also thinks that the permission to use coercion or force in defense of right is built into the concept of right. Like we're defining this, not, like nothing here talks about the state being so special, right? It's just talking about freedom and coercion and the meaning of these terms, right? Meanings of these terms. So, yeah, he thinks in principle it's built into the concept, but consistent with the concept, only the state can exercise coercion. So you and I cannot do it in a way that honors what's going on here. Unless we were police in a state, of course. Right? But then you're working out of your function. All right, I'm going to really quickly put the last steps on here. That will be the end of this today. So this is just the conclusion where we are, right? Coercion that hinders, coercion promotes freedom. It's just applying what we just said. And so it's a hindrance to freedom. Now, if actions are wrong insofar as they hinder people's rights to straight freedom to choose, then it follows that it's morally right to use coercion that hinders coercion. And if it's right, then it's not wrong. So, all right. Hey, we got through it today. See you guys on Tuesday for more Kant.